welcoming you to the Delaware COVID-19 Health and Wellness Working Group. This June 9th, 2020 meeting is being called to order at 5 p.m. This meeting is being held electronically. On March 12, 2020, Governor Carney issued a declaration of a state of emergency for the state of Delaware due to a public health threat. The state of emergency allows all public meetings of executive branch public bodies, including the Delaware COVID-19 Health and Wellness Reopening Workgroup, to be conducted electronically, either by means of telephone conference call or video conference call. The information regarding this meeting, including information on how to access the meeting electronically, was published on June 2nd, 2020 on the state public meeting calendar site. Individuals may participate in this meeting via DOE YouTube channel publicized on the agenda. These meetings are public meetings to provide transparency and the opportunity for the public to engage in the process. In order to enable everyone to have voice, public must be accepted via reopen.us or via voicemail at 302-735-4244. All comments and ideas are forwarded to work groups for review and posted on DOE's website as well. Each week, public comment is compiled from the previous week and posted online. A copy is also provided to the workgroup chairs to then share overall themes related to the responses that may impact the work at hand. We encourage working group members to review these comments online before each meeting. To summarize public comment this week, the public comment included a great deal of feedback from many of our schools, such as school nurses, counselors, and psychologists. These stakeholders shared many resources that can help our committee as we continue to refine the essential actions and protocols. They also shared specific resources that can be used to guide our educational leaders as they work to determine implementing our framework. We want to thank these groups for their continued involvement, resources, and guidance. We also heard from our stakeholders, such as Victor J. Leonard, of the importance of continued transparency. As a result of the feedback, all slides, readings, and materials are now available on the Delaware Public Meeting Calendar. We continue to urge all members of the public to join the discussions, provide comment, and resources for the committee to consider. The link to tonight's readings materials will be shown in an upcoming slide. Next slide, Patrick. So here's our agenda for tonight. We're going to start off with introductions. Next, we'll provide a recap of the assignment where we will review the integration of the feedback that was received from this committee last week and take a look at what scenario 1 essential actions look after we integrate the feedback. We will then take a deep dive into the first part of scenario 2 where we talk about minimal to moderate spread. And then finally, we will close the evening with a recap of next week's assignments. Next slide. Patches, next slide. Okay. So again, I am Mike Rodriguez. I am one of the co-chairs on the Health and Wellness Committee. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Megan Walls, the other co-chair.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us again tonight, everyone. I'm Dr. Megan Walls. I'm a pediatric psychologist at Nemours, and I'm happy to be here with you tonight.
Mike, I'm not sure if you wanted me to introduce myself again. I'm Mario Ramirez. I'm part of the Opportunity Labs team that is supporting the Department of Education. By background, I'm an emergency medicine physician and was formerly the director for pandemic and emerging threats at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Next slide.
So we are going to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves again tonight. As you can see, we tried to list folks in order so that you can know who is next. So again, just your name, your organization, and we'll move on to the next person and your role as well. So we'll start with Dr. Fitzgerald.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Fitzgerald. I'm the superintendent of the Cesar Rodney School District, and I am representing the Chief School Officers Organization.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Laretha Odumasu. I am the Executive Director over the Charter School of Newcastle Middle School and representing charters.
I'm Susan Haberstroh. I'm the Director of School Support Services at the Delaware Department of Education.
I'm Stacy Greenlee. I'm a school counselor at Polytech High School, and I'm happy to be representing the school counselors in Delaware.
So this is Dana Kott. I'm representing the Department of Health and Social Services, Division of Public Health.
Hi, this is Sue Smith, and I'm a school nurse for Milford School District for 25 years, and I'm happy to represent the Delaware school nurses.
Emma?
Hi, I'm a Sussex Tech senior, and I'm the student representative for this committee.
I'm Daphne Carnwright, the Family Support Program Manager with Autism Delaware and the former chairperson of the Governor's Advisory Council for Exceptional Citizens. And I'm here to represent the interests of the disability community.
Marisol?
Good evening once again, everyone. This is Reverend Thomas Howard Jr. I am the pastor of Mount Joy United Spirit Church, and I'm here representing the State Board of Education.
Representative Longhurst?
Hi, this is Representative Longhurst. This represents Delaware House.
Good evening. This is Representative. I'm in the 22nd District. I'm also in the education.
Hello, this is Anthony Del Colo. Senator District 7.
Senator Sturgeon?
Oh, yeah, hello. I'm Senator Laura Sturgeon from the 4th District and just recently retired teacher. So very happy to be part of this group. Also chair of the Senate Education Committee.
Kristen Dorr, Director of Education Association.
Hey, Pat, do you think we could mute everyone?
Yeah, part of the problem is even as speakers, we're going to have to unmute or mute ourselves, and almost use the mute unmute as almost like a walkie-talkie. When you're going to talk, we need to hit the unmute, and then immediately when you're done, you're going to need to mute, because what we're getting is feedback from speakers in people's individual offices.
Thank you. Can you change it over to the next slide, please? So, again, welcome committee members. So first and foremost, the committee welcomes and values public comment. If you want to make a public comment, please email us at reopeningideas@doe.k12.de.us, or you can do it via voicemail at 302-735-4244. All the public comments that are made will be posted on DDOE's reopening page, and you see the link there. The other thing that we've done is if you look at the last bullet, that link allows the public to view all the reading material, the assignments, anything that the committee looked at, you have the ability to look at it also. So we've provided you with that link. Next slide. So why are we here? Again, our goal is to work towards a framework that allows Delaware school leaders to decide what needs to be done in each of the three scenarios. Please remember that the how details are outside the scope of this work group. However, we do plan on collating all the comments, all the questions, so that those that make the how decisions will have that information. Our committee's goal is to look at the scenario-based planning document and look at it through the lens of health and wellness. But please keep in mind that as we look at these documents, that they're not set in stone, that our job is to Delawareize them so that your feedback, your input is going to be extremely valuable in placing this document in the Delaware context. Next slide.
So continuing with the purpose, we want to make sure that we're focusing on these actions and protocols that we need to implement during any scenario. And again, we'll talk about a little bit about this week's scenario, but the goal is to be able to cover all scenarios. We also want to really make sure that we're focusing on equity and incorporating community and constituency feedback. And then we also want to highlight areas and create flexibility in the documents as the data evolves. So as we get new data and, as we hear from experts in the area, certainly we need to be flexible on what our planning might be. Next slide. Just an assignment recap so that folks who are joining us today who were not with us last week have an idea. As you can see, today is June 9th, so we will be discussing scenario 2, minimal to moderate spread. We are going to discuss the first half of that scenario. There is a lot of protocols in this one, understandably, because this is sort of our medium spread, so we need to make a lot of plans. And then next week, we'll carry over that discussion. June 23rd, we'll be discussing scenario 3, which is what happens if there is a very substantial spread in the community. And on June 30th, our recommendations are due to the secretary with all of our commentary incorporated. Next slide.
So given our tight timeline and the amount of important discussion that we will need to engage in, it's essential that we set some norms. A few of the norms that will keep us focused are everyone has voice and not one person should dominate the conversation or the discussion. We should respect all the opinions and honor the multiple perspectives of the members of this committee. We should stay focused on our goal and purpose through the lens of health and wellness. It's really important that we're succinct, and this last piece is really important. Compromises may be necessary. I think as we've all noticed with reading the public comment, there are a lot of opinions, but remember our charge. Our charge is to deliver a product to the secretary so that decisions can be made. Our educational leaders have the appropriate what so they can open up schools. One of the adaptations that we made for this meeting is that the chat feature will not be used. So if a committee member wishes to participate, you will need to raise your hand and you'll be invited to unmute to share your comments. Next slide.
The first thing we wanted to do tonight in terms of actual work is go and discuss just a little bit about scenario 1. Mike and I, along with Mario, tried to incorporate the feedback from last time. As Mike mentioned, some of it is trying to make sure we're giving the what and not necessarily all the how details. But we wanted to check. We had sent out to the group the scenario 1 revisions draft document. And we wanted to check in with all of you on if we have appropriately captured feedback, if there's anything specifically that you think is missing before we move on to scenario 2. And we want to make sure we're not too focused on this the entire meeting this time because we want to get to scenario 2, but that we check in to see if there are particular things that we think we need to add in. And Patrick, you'll have to tell us if anyone's raising their hand to comment. I can't see that, so.
Okay, so we've got two right now. We've got Ms. Cartwright, and then we've got one hand up from Ms. Smith.
Daphne, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I just had two questions about the revision. First, we talked a good deal about supports necessary for students with disabilities in this scenario, and I'm not sure how if there are any reflected changes that kind of support those needs. I think that is still missing. And then my second question was in regard to our comments last time about the difficulty for families to obtain and use thermometers. And I see that a revision was made instead of requiring families to check the temperature, the switch was made to the wording of it is suggested, or let me see what the wording is. The parents should check the student's temperature instead of required to. So I'm just wondering, like, what changed in the safety needs from the first draft to this revision? What changed in regard to the safety needs that now parents would not need to check the temperature? It's just that they should. So those are my two comments or questions. I also noticed that the list of medically vulnerable students and teachers really isn't complete compared to the CDC's website, in that the CDC lists persons with disabilities, and we don't specifically state that here at all. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Daphne. I'll note the first and the last thing you said down, and if you could, certainly, if there are specific wording that you still think is missing, if you can send our way and we will get it updated into that draft. In terms of the should, I think that was in reference to everyone saying they didn't think it was possible. And I think we were trying to hear that feedback that if temps are not possible, then we are going to change the language to should, knowing that every kid might not be able to do so at home. We're happy to hear other folks' feedback, but that was what we thought we heard from the committee, was we couldn't go for that specific wording. But if you can send us suggestions on those other 2 points, we'll make sure we get them in there. Thank you. I think Sue Smith is next. Or did I skip someone, Patches?
It's me, Sue Smith. Thank you for giving me Thank you for giving me a minute. I just want to share perspective from the school nurses when we talk about the crisis team. It's really important that we recommend that the school nurse is included on the crisis team, because in the school setting, most of the time, students will present to us with social emotional problems as a stomach ache or not feeling well. It's easier for them to ask to come see the school nurse than to ask to go see the counselor, because less questions are asked. When you say, can I go see the school nurse, most teachers will send. So it's really important to include the school nurses in that. The other aspect of that is we're a lot of times the first contact for parents. Parents will call us with social emotional concerns with their children, because we're available in the school nurse office to answer the phone. And we also have that student connection. So I just want to put, school nurses are so important to be a part of the team.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Kristen Dwyer is next, I think.
Hi, folks. Thank you for all the changes that were made to the document. I just have a couple of questions. In the document, about a crisis response team. I guess to me, I'm just a little bit confused. Our specialists have called the pandemic a crisis. So I don't know if you're calling it a crisis response team because that's how that's the terminology that has been given to the pandemic, or if these teams will only be triggered if a child is in crisis.
I'm sorry, can you say that again, Kristen?
The crisis response team, I'm just trying to understand why you came up with the name. Are you calling it a crisis response team because we're referring to the pandemic as a crisis, or is the team specifically in place in case a child is in crisis?
Mario, feel free to weigh in on that, but my interpretation was just to have the team ready in case there's an issue.
Yeah, Kristen, when it was drafted, it was meant to reflect that this was a crisis as a whole, not for a particular student in crisis.
Okay, because that's helpful because when a lot of our specialists seem to feel that it's not about them reacting when the student is displaying, going to the nurse because they have a stomach ache or anything, if they're displaying any kind of behavioral problems or mental problems overtly. It's about, having the specialists go in there and lay the groundwork so that they can reach all the kids as they start to come in and start talking about this and start handling individual cases as they come up, but creating that space for kids to feel safe to talk about what they went through during this time. So I was just concerned that, we've yet again just kind of put aside what can be done to help children during this time as a whole. And we just kind of went to one-offs, like, let's just deal with it as they come. And that's just some food for thought. In another bullet point, you talk about providing teachers with adequate time. I would just ask that you add on, teachers obviously need adequate time when they come in the beginning of the year if we were to go back. And so I'm very appreciative of that addition, but also not to beat a dead horse, but our specialists need additional time as they come in when the school starts. They have a lot on their caseload in regards to assessing children, communicating with families, what have you. And I would encourage the department to go back and look at some of their regulations to see how we can ease and give those, not only those teachers, but those specialists some adequate time. And I'd also be curious to understand, what do you mean by giving of adequate time? I don't really understand what that looks like. And if you would follow up on my suggestion about looking at regulations for things that may be due by the end of the month of September, specifically around the unit count, for instance. So if you could just help me understand what time would look like for teachers and specialists.
Are you asking what adequate time would look like?
Yes.
Okay. Do we have some other members of the committee that would like to speak to that? I know that we are a local decision state. A lot of those decisions would be made locally. I know that we're not mandating those, so I don't know if we have a charter school lead or Dr. Fitzgerald, if you want to weigh in on what your thinking is and how you're going to handle that, that perspective would be valuable.
I guess this is Laretha speaking. As far as the adequate time, if I am hearing Ms. Swire correctly, I think it refers to the documents that might be due to the DOE. So September 30th, unit count, things of that nature. If any of those will be extended, considering the beginning of the school year will look slightly different.
Thanks, Larissa. And Kristen, I think part of that might indeed be, like Mike was talking about, what adequate time looks like has to be further fleshed out. So I'm going to write that down. I think Representative Longhurst is next up for comments. Can everyone mute themselves again? If you're not muted, we're hearing a little bit of feedback again. And then Representative Longhurst, go ahead.
Thanks, Megan. First, I'd like to follow up with Sue Smith when she said to add school nurses to the crisis response team. I think they definitely need to be added to that response team. But secondly, I guess when I look at that response team, not all schools have counselors and psychologists. So I think there's kind of a problem there when you have a crisis team, that school nurses are in all schools, but psychologists and counselors are not in all schools. So how do you create a crisis response team when there doesn't exist psychologists or counselors? That would be my question.
I think that's really fair. And, what I'm going to write down here, and you tell me if this captures that accurately, but it sounds like one of the things you want to be added here is making sure we have appropriate and adequate mental health workforce in each school as we move forward to make these teams.
And that's great, but can you identify what mental health support is? I mean, You could say school nurse, you can say counselor, you can say psychologist, but after that, what else is the definition of that person? Because is it a teacher? I mean, you're going to run into problems where you're not going to have the psychologists and the counselors. So I don't know how that crisis response team is going to work unless you extend the definition of those mental health workers. And maybe that's what we need to do. Who does this use?
So I think that specifically what we need to say is counselors and school psychologists versus the more general term.
Right, but I'll go back to my original statement. There's not all schools have psychologists and counselors.
I hear you. So that's what I'm saying. I think we need to say that we have adequate workforce in each school for that. We have to make sure we do.
And the adequate workforce would be defined as?
I mean, I think an adequate workforce would be defined as what folks talk about their district ratios being, as we've talked about before. But I think what I'm hearing you say is we can't have these crisis teams without making sure we have those folks available in every single school.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you.
I'll write that. Absolutely. Dana, I think you're next.
Thank you. I was actually just going to make a comment about if I think if this part, and I don't want to belabor this, is framed around looking at schools and districts all hazards crisis plans, which all schools should have, then I think it takes away some of the confusion and some of the layering of who and how, because all schools should have all hazards plans, and this should be a comprehensive part of an all hazards plan. So I'm glad I was going to put this in written feedback, but I think putting this scenario and this particular crisis and individual students crisis in an all hazards framework, I think really makes it it sort of broadens the lens a little bit and allows us to think about all the different people that should be at the table in the school building at the district level, or resources from the community as well. So I'm glad to provide written comments, and I'll provide some resources as well for all hazards planning for schools.
Thanks, Dana. That was really helpful. And then Stacy, I think, is the last one waiting for comment on this particularly.
Hi, I just wanted to speak on the crisis team. I wholeheartedly agree with Sue that school nurses are a vital part of our crisis teams. They often know the students in and out. There are members in the school that are trying to bridge the gap if there's not counselors and social workers. Often there's family crisis therapists at the elementary level, behavioral health consultants at the middle school level, and then wellness centers at the high school, as well as contracted services with maybe Delaware Guidance or People's Place and that sort of thing. So there's lots of different members that can be a part of that crisis team. Crisis team does not have to be just a response to a crisis. It's often planning. And I think in this case, this is something we're already starting on in our school, is talking about whether it's scenario 1, 2, or 3, what can we do to support the students coming back? So we're already putting those plans in place and having those discussions. I mean, nothing formal, obviously, but having those discussions and gathering resources. So crisis is not always the response, but preparation and planning as well.
Thank you. Daphne, did you have your hand back up?
Yes, thank you. I also agree with really taking a good look at the crisis team and who is on that, and should include school nurses and others that are, vital to that work. I had 2 other comments or questions, I guess. Now that I've seen scenario 2 and have something to compare it with, or if you have a picture of another option in education during this time, I have these 2 questions. Number 1, what if there are requirements of, let's say, scenario 1 that a district cannot implement let's say they don't have access to hand sanitizer or enough soap or cleaning products or what have you, should we include some kind of guidance on if they're unable to implement this scenario and this is the spread scenario that we are in, then what happens? And then my last question is, now that I've seen scenario 2 also, I'm wondering about the last page of scenario 1 and when it talks about families should make individual decisions or talk with their providers. Plan 2 is a little more clear on who has the final determination. This one is not so clear, like who gets to determine then if a child does not or staff does not go back to school because of individual concerns. So just kind of clarifying that, like how is that final decision made in those individual cases?
Awesome, thank you. I just wrote both of those down. We'll see if we can get some clarity around that. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I don't see, just trying to see if everyone has lowered their hand here. Stacy, did you have another comment or is your hand just up from before? All right, I'm gonna assume we're good. We're can this, I think, heck, we can go to that next slide, Patches. We're gonna hand it over to Mario to talk just a little bit more about scenario 2.
Great, thank you, Megan. So just to recap for everyone, this is the sort of minimal to moderate spread, which is essentially where Delaware is right now. What this scenario envisions is that community spread has essentially sort of centered around an R naught of 1. It may be slightly higher, maybe slightly lower, but meaning that we've essentially hit something of a steady state or haven't completely reduced to a minimal spread situation. This correlates with Delaware roadmap phase 1 to 2. And it essentially says that school opening should be situation dependent on a number of factors that we'll talk about next. And next slide. Next slide, Patches. Yep. So I realize that we have a typo here under virus status. So this should be R naught around 1 as opposed to greater than 1. But in this situation, there could be a situation where there is more disease that is starting to occur. Primarily what we worry about here is that schools are going from fully open scenario to one where we're thinking about having to again, and how would we adjust operations as a result? And from a public health standpoint, that means that we may be approaching a situation where there are not enough hospital beds or enough intensive care unit capability to support what the community needs, or we may not be able to test and accurately trace all the people who may be infected. Next slide, Patches. And so just to encapsulate what that means, it means that essentially the school preparedness activities are moving from sort of a kind of fully open situation to one where we are taking steps to sort of rapidly shift from a fully open scenario to one where we're partially closed or possibly having to implement kind of virtual teaching or other things. And as part of that, we're trying to reduce the spread of disease. And so that means reducing the frequency of large gatherings, possibly changing school schedules, changing the way that students and teachers are interacting. It may also require some short-term dismissals if there are positive cases in the school themselves. And so it's really the movement from sort of a preparedness phase to more of an active mitigation phase. Next slide, Patches.
So before I go into this next slide, are there any questions for Mario before we move on? Are there any hands up?
We have 2 hands raised. I think Senator, we've got 2. We've got Longhurst, and then we have DeCullough. Both have their hands up, and then Dr. Fitzgerald as well.
Senator DeCullough, you want to start?
Longhurst.
Oh, okay.
I
Sorry. I think
my hand down, so it didn't mean to be up there. So you can move on.
My apologies. I was thinking that might have been the case, but my apologies.
Senator Del Colo, go ahead.
Thanks. I had my hand raised from before, but I was going to make a note that, and I'm not sure where all these funds are allocated at this point, but I know that things that are directly related to COVID response are able to use the resources that were provided in the CARES Act, of which Delaware received about $1 billion. So if that's something that becomes necessary, something we need to look to, I think it's reasonable to get a picture of where, how much of those funds have been allocated, where they are, and if there's any that can be set aside to provide these sorts of supports for schools. Because I think that the recurring theme of where are the resources, where's the staff, if they're not there, the actual PPE or what have you is going to be an ongoing thing. And there was just a general question that I got from a member of the public about whether the draft recommendations were available somewhere, because we're going to have them from scenario 1 and certainly have one for scenario 2. So that was just a general question.
So I believe, yes, that we can provide that information, and I think that's an excellent question. I really think that that the CARES money now is available for LEAs to be applying for it, and we will definitely we can work on releasing that information to everyone, so everyone can kind of see the upcoming scenarios and the things that the LEAs might need to be looking at, or expenditures that they might need to be thinking about that maybe they weren't aware of prior to this.
And frankly, as things develop and as we start to see, I mean, obviously we all want this to be a scenario 1 type thing, but probably makes sense for our group, if somebody hasn't thought of it already, to make a recommendation about, if it's trending in this way and we're not sure and it could go south or north, maybe here's a good amount to try to sort of leave aside and not allocate so that we can make sure that we're serving these communities. I mean, we saw that it worked marvelously with the Budget Stabilization Fund to be able to allow us to plug this year's budget. And I think that the similar microcosm scenario would work here as well, as we look at how to support all of our educational authorities as they're going through these potential outcomes.
Excellent point, Senator. Okay.
And Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the other question there was also if we're posting the recommendations. Is that right?
That's right. Like there was I got a question, a text message actually from a member of the public who's tuned in, someone watching at home. Where can we find the drafts of stuff? Was the question.
So the drafts we have posted on with all the materials that the committee's reviewing. It's on the public meeting calendar website. So we should be able to see the drafts of the scenario 1 with the feedback from the committee and all the readings. And we'll be sure to add whatever the outcomes are tonight, and we'll post those also. So they should be on the public meeting website.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Okay, so
I think Dr.
You have a question?
Yeah, yes, I do. Thank you. So in looking at what we talked about before with scenario 1, that was in a perfect world, it would be what we would have if we were opening. What I see today or tonight is Dr. Ramirez just showed us that right now Delaware is in minimal to moderate spread. And as I look at scenario 2, if I was to open school next week, this is what I would be looking at. So unless we move backwards to last week's scenario, this is really what I need to key on if I want to open school sometime in August, or what I want to make my preparations for as we move forward. Is that correct? This is the one that we need to spend the most time on. This is the one that currently exists. This is the one that in all likelihood I'm going to have to deal with unless things get a lot better or a lot worse.
You know what? That's an excellent point. You know, as I prepared for today, Dr. Fitzgerald, that was my number one aha moment. You know, this is the unknown. You know, we've lived scenario one prior to this. We've lived scenario 3 where we're quarantined, masked up, social distancing. This is really the unknown. And you're right. This is the one we're going to spend the most time on. And it's a little scary because we don't know what's going to happen. But that's why I think it's really important as we look at at these protocols that we really just take a deep dive and provide the appropriate feedback. Because again, this is the part that we just don't know what we're going to experience and we don't know what it's going to be like. So great point, Dr. Fitzgerald. So if there aren't any further questions, as we all know, we're going to head into now scenario 2, and this scenario is the minimal to moderate spread. Yes.
Mike, we did have a few more hands raised, or if you want to hold them, or we can take them now. It's up to you.
No, go ahead. Let's listen to the questions.
Representative Smith, you had your hand raised. I wanted to make sure, but I think you lowered it, so I don't know if you wanted to.
I'll bring it up later.
Okay. We just wanted to make sure we got you. And then I think we had, let me see here. Laretha?
Hi, yes, thank you, Patches. Another question, I think another consideration, just listening to Senator Del Cola regarding the funding, is if there will be additional, possibly additional funding. Some of our schools, especially our charters, are starting off without having enough technology and things of that nature. So a lot of the stimulus funding will be utilized towards making sure that we can actually run a remote program successfully and have equitable practices for all of our students. So I think another question out there will be around funding because, you know, money is only going to stretch but so far when we're looking at purchasing technology devices for our students. And that's just something for consideration as it pertains to these different scenarios.
And just to add to that, as I reviewed a couple of the applications from charters, and that has been a very common expenditure with the CARES money, just ensuring that if we have to go to a scenario that's virtual, that the schools have the necessary equipment in order to service their students.
Thank you.
Are there other questions, Patches?
As of right now, there are no other, let me see here. There are no other hands raised.
Okay, great. So again, our charge is pretty simple here in this scenario in that we need to look at the protocols and we need to determine if what's there is good enough or if we want to implement increased safety checks above and beyond what's in the protocol. And we're gonna do this using the same framing that we used last week. You know, what needs to be added, what needs to be removed, or what needs to be tweaked. I think that as Megan and I collate your information, if you could be specific on those recommendations, it would really help us when we go back and try to integrate that feedback into the revised document. So if we could start to think about it in those terms, it'd be very helpful to us. That way we don't have to guess and we have more specificity from the committee members. Next slide.
I think we skipped a slide. Did we skip a slide, Patches?
I'm sorry. Yep.
There we go. Okay, so we're going to start to dig into this now. As with last time, if there are specific comments or things we need to add or remove, this again is due now. So we talked a little bit about these crisis teams. I'm going to note again in here that we need to discuss who's on those response teams. But if there are any other comments on this particularly, you can let us know.
So Patches, are there any hands up?
The hands are starting to raise. I think I saw Representative Smith first, then Susan Haberstroh, and then we had Representative Longhurst.
Go ahead, Representative Smith.
Thank you. To bring up the first part about the temperature checks and things of that nature, in thinking about technology and thinking about equity and thinking about how the role of the parents versus the role of the school, I do know that there's good technology out there with cameras that not only do kind of the safety side of it, but also do the health side of it. So that'll do, facial recognition, temperatures up to a margin of 0.3. It also does people counting and does metal detection as well. So that's something to consider with some of the CARES Act money, probably procured from a school district level, because that's how you could also save on cost. But that also would help from parents, having to do temperatures at home, what the likelihood of the supply chain being an issue with thermometers at that point, potentially, just things to consider. There's also a group at the University of Delaware who came up with an app that allows you to connect with the teacher, kind of like you would on an app or a website now, depending on what school you go to, but that you would actually fill in your child's symptoms and things like that. So you're, making it more engaging and you're being proactive about it. So I wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Susan, I think you're next.
Good evening. This is more of a process question, and it goes to what Dr. Fitzgerald was talking about. Let's assume that we start in scenario 2. There's a lot of items that have to have been done in scenario 1. So is the expectation you look at it, scenario 1, check off, you've done all of that, and then you go into the additional in scenario 2. So for instance, I'm looking at scenario 1 where we have mental health assessments. So, and I'm looking at scenario 2 where it's just talking about encourage schools to implement mental health screening for all students, but we don't necessarily have some of that same language. So just for process, do you go through 1 and then the additional is scenario 2?
Mario, you can weigh in on this, but I think as they were written, it was to be each scenario individually.
Actually, no, I'm sorry. In that case, they were supposed to be additive. So you would go through all of the things that were there for the minimal scenario first, and then these would be additional measures.
I think Representative Longhurst is next.
Hello again. So, first of all, I have to say this is like, you guys have done an amazing job of outlining everything and hitting every scenario. And as I go through this, I'm thoroughly impressed on what you put together in such a short amount of time. And it all looks perfect if you had a Christmas gift, it was wrapped in a pretty red bow. But I'm going to have to, I'm going to be a Debbie Downer for a minute and say, how are the schools, when I look at the mental health and physical and social emotional health, when schools open, screening students, these can't be, in what ideal world do we have? Like, who's going to do all this? And maybe Kevin can jump in on this, is how the school's going to take this and say, well, I need extra staff. Because I don't see how a teacher is going to be able to do a lot of this screening and one school nurse and a school counselor so I'm trying to figure out, like, as I look through all this, which is, like I said, it's like a gift. It's perfectly wrapped in this beautiful bow. But when you open it up, who's doing all this stuff? Are we considering that as we go through this? Like, how does it look for a school to give the school this? Where do they get the resources, and who are these resources, and who's going to be doing it? And, are teachers going to be taken out of classrooms to do some of this stuff, or who's going to be doing it? And maybe Kevin, I don't know if you could jump in and like kind of help me out here. Somebody in the school explain to me
Representative Longhurst, it looks quite daunting. I would I would agree with you that right now, and even having looked at scenario one and looked at the CDC guidelines, that we're overwhelmed right now, and that's the issue that all of the school districts and I'm sure charter schools are facing, is how to take care and meet all of the challenges that we're facing. We certainly don't have enough. We certainly don't have the psychologists. We don't have the guidance counselors. We don't have. We don't really have even the enough nurses to actually implement everything that we see that we need to take place in order to guarantee the wellness of all of our students. So we understand that there are challenges moving forward. You know, we're trying to also make sure that we provide for the curricular needs, and I know that's another work group, but yeah, looking at all of this stuff right now, I kind of feel overwhelmed. So I appreciate you bringing up that issue.
Well, and I think that, I think that needs to be a part of our conversation if we're going to put forward some recommendations, the burden that's going to put on the schools. And I could say, for one, that these kids aren't coming back to school like they did last year. Okay. They've been out of school. They haven't been around a lot of their friends. They've had to learn how to do stuff on the internet. And, the schools are going to be overwhelmed. So, Megan, I don't know if you put a summary in there about, staffing or how this is going to accomplish. I think it's all beautiful. And in the perfect world, this would be perfect, but we're not in that perfect world. And as Kevin just said, he's overwhelmed, and this is even more overwhelming. It's going to be a tough fall without the staffing that you need. That's it.
Yeah, thanks to no, I think it's a really good point, and I appreciate both of you. We've talked a bit offline and with some of our partners about this, and I think our goal here, and this is not to say those things aren't important, but is to figure out what first and then how. But I think the follow-up to that, to your point, both Dr. Fitzgerald and Representative Longhurst, is if we can't, right? If the how is we're not going to be able to do this, then we might have to move more to talking about more virtual learning again. So I think we have to sort of take those things into consideration as we move, because I think you're exactly right. Our goal is to figure out what, and then can it happen? And if it can't happen safely, how do we move forward otherwise? But I wrote that down about staffing and some other points you made. Kristen, I think you're next.
Hi, folks. I just want to echo some of the thank yous that Representative Longhurst had mentioned. Everything that you put together is very comprehensive. I just have a couple of questions. Most notably, a lot throughout the document, you talk about parents. There is a population of children who don't have parents. They have different types of guardians, or they're homeless. So a lot of the at-home checks, especially for the homeless population, I'm concerned about how that will happen if they aren't going, to a house every night, going home to a family every night, going home to a caregiver every night. We do have some families that are in shelters and whatnot. So I don't know if these guidelines talk about how to manage those types of populations, or how we could utilize our school social workers more to help in that. And while I was thinking about that while reading it, it occurred to me, and Dr. Ramirez, you're probably the person I'm looking to for the answer to this question. For schools that are located within like high risk populations, in our rural communities or in the city of Wilmington, are the guidelines enough for those schools where, they could be exposed at a greater degree than other kids throughout the state? And so I was wondering whether or not the guidelines are equitable in that way, or if it's, that's neither here nor there. They are or they aren't. I just wondered, do those schools need additional support or guidelines?
If it's okay, I can answer that question, Megan. So I would say, Kristen, that you probably can't do it at the school level because that's not generally how a virus like this behaves. So the geographic areas that are affected are larger than just a particular school district, particularly in a state that is, relatively small like Delaware compared to places like Texas that are much bigger geographic areas. So I'm not sure that you can segment it out that level and define one school as being higher risk relative to another. I think rather than define it at the school level, you can only define it in terms of the community, and that's really a function of the local, public health departments and how granular the data is that they're getting. But I would expect that the geographic areas are bigger than just a single school.
And thank you for that. Just one last follow up or one last question, kind of in the same vein. We do have some schools that one that comes to mind is Stubbs. It's a dual generation center. They have folks from the community coming in and getting resources, access to resources, state resources, community resources. But other schools throughout the state also offer similar types of resources to the community. I see a lot of talk in the plan regarding, extracurricular activities for students. Are there any guidelines, unless maybe I missed it, I may have missed it, around how do we close those down, don't let the community in type of thing? How will those centers function if we are in this scenario?
Was that a question for me, or is that a question for someone else on the committee? I would say that we don't have specific protocols in here right now. To that, there are other states that we're working with that do have those sorts of protocols, and so I would say that if we feel like that's needed here, we should make that recommendation to bring in that sort of work.
Thank you. Something to think about.
Thanks, Kristen. Sue Smith, you're next.
Just on the line of talking about the different students and our families and our state demographics and all, concern a lot about, once students are identified when they come to school and they are ill, transportation, getting them home and those kinds of things can always be a problem. So help, recommendations for all districts, because some districts make out really well with having transportation home and others don't. The other thing is when we go back talking about thermometers, different ideas of asking local businesses, because the no-touch thermometers can be anywhere from $80 to $120. And that's a big expense out of the school nurse's budget. And the CARE Act money is going for a lot of things, hand sanitizers, masks, and different things in our school system. So a lot of these are building specific things, but I think a lot of recommendations that come out from maybe this work group so that things are consistent statewide, as even when we get into talking about when a student is positive and notifying families and stuff is, we need direction that all of our communication is the same throughout the state for specific things. I mean, there's certain things in district that aren't going to be the same, but basic guidelines, because you can call somewhere one day and get a message and then call another day and get a different message. So consistency, I think, throughout this whole situation is really, really important. There's a lot, as we go through this, there's a lot of things, like immunizations. Are they going to, once there's an immunization developed, are they going to be mandatory? Things like that I don't know if this would come from this work group or from public health. But a lot of things that school nurses have a lot of questions about basic to our office, like when we talk about spacing and those kinds of things. Some nurses' offices in the state may not have a restroom in their office. Some may not have a sink, and it's hard to believe, but because we've got a lot of older buildings and all, they may not. So looking at recommendations from working with the admin, working with the nurse for maybe relocation or additional spacing and those kinds of things. So there's just a lot of things that it's taking care of our students. But if we go from phase 1 to phase 2, one thing was in phase 2 it's all the seats sitting forward, but in phase 1 it's like it's normal. But increased risk of the unknown, maybe students should be facing forward in phase 1. So just some thoughts from perspective.
Thanks, Sue. I see there's a couple other hand raised. Patches, can we go to the next slide just to make sure that I hear folks talking about sort of not just this, but what's on some of the other slides. So let's go to that next slide just because I think some of these conversations are coming from both. And I just want to be mindful of our time. If we need next week to do some of this stuff, we can as well. But I think given that we have a lot of these points to go through, I just want to make sure we're, as we sort of talk about more than what was just on that slide, that we're getting through this.
Thanks, Megan. So the next slide is if schools are instructed to close. Anything we need to tweak, change, add? Patches, as the hands get raised, let us know and we'll keep the conversation rolling.
We still have several hands raised from earlier, I do believe. So I don't know if people want to re-raise their hand. Please know that if they're raised, we'll call on you here shortly. I think the first one we had that was still raised from last time would be, I think it would be Reverend Powell.
Yes, I just wanted to reemphasize the importance of what has already been said, and it's around assessments. I had done some research and looked at some information from the Alliance for Excellent Education. I'll try to be succinct. And that was one of the very things that they suggested that was so critical and important to make sure that we had perhaps an assessment that was one virtual because of the fluidness of scenario 1 and possibly scenario 2. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was we talked about resources. And I think that it's important for us to Delaware-rise this, if you would, and look at maximizing and look at what we can do in terms of generating the particular resources together. And then the last point is that it indicate that the state should survey districts about the diagnostic assessments that are currently used and perhaps offer those assessments to the districts also, so that there would be some uniformity with regards to assessing. I know academic assessments in another group, but you're talking about the social, emotional impact that social isolation has made, the trauma in order, young people have endured this trauma. And so I just wanted to re-emphasize the need for those assessments.
Thank you, Reverend Powell.
I think Larissa was next.
Hello, just so I'm understanding the flow of if schools are instructed to close versus if they're instructed to open, is there a space of the rotating schedule, or is it just all open and closed and kind of a back and forth with that? I just wanted to understand that a little bit more.
We're going to actually get to that in a bit. On the protocol tonight, there's a little bit about open and closing schedules and closing for cleaning and some of those things. So we'll definitely get to that discussion.
Okay, thank you.
I think Daphne was next.
Thank you. I just have a question overall. It's not really about any one particular slide, but in thinking about, is there something that's missing? Often we see need for training, and I know this is a brand new situation to everyone, and we may not have a lot of information, but does anyone feel that they're, adding in a place for training for staff or whomever might be something that would be helpful to everybody so that they get accurate information as they move through the different plans?
Daphne, I think that's an excellent point. As I, again, process this document and continue to prepare for today, I think that in the do now, again, this is just me, but in the do now, we might want to consider where do parents and teachers fall into that, because it is all new. And they're going to, the stakeholders are going to need support. What's the role of the parent? How are they going to support ensuring that we catch if someone is has the virus, that we catch it before they get to the bus stop, which is one of the examples that was shared at the operations committee meeting. What's the role of the teachers? They're going to need support, and we're going to need consistency across the board and helping them prepare so they can best meet the needs for our students. So I think we should consider maybe moving some of those pieces and do now, or if not there, at least when school's open, but we have to engage them sooner rather than later.
I think I see a few more comments. In the interest of time, just because we have technically 25 minutes left and want to get through some of this, most of what's in this mental, physical, social, emotional health is in the protocols as well. So Patches, can we go to the slide where the protocol, where it says protocol discussion scenario 2, tonight's protocol? I think you have to just skip a couple of these here, but this stuff that we're kind of going past is in the protocols, and I'll hand it back to you, Mike, just to talk briefly about this.
Okay, so tonight's goal was to get through the first 6 protocols. We have about 23 minutes left. Next week, we're going to do the remaining 4. If we don't get through all 6 this evening, they'll just be bumped into next week. Next slide.
So, I know we talked a little bit about what's going to happen. So here is some of the recommendations on spacing and movement. So look at this slide, any specific things, and let's try really hard to stick to these bullet points. There is more in the next 2 slides about spacing and movement as well, but let's try really hard just to comment on these for now. And Patches, let us know if you see any new hands go up. If there are still hands from before, we can comment if it's on this slide, and we promise to get back to some of the other stuff, larger picture as well. Kristen, I don't know if your hand is up from, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Patches.
I was just going to say, and then Kristen also had her hand up. So I was going to send you a list. Several have come up with questions on this.
Okay, thanks. Kristen, I'm not sure if you were actually first, but go ahead because I got your name sent to me, and let's get this moving.
Okay, I just had a question regarding class sizes to be kept less than 20 students. It's funny, DSEA has been advocating for smaller class sizes since the day before forever. So here we go. But I do have, the capital needs of this plan, is the first thing that comes to mind. And so I see you go to a staggered school schedule. My question would be, is there any guidance we can give, or is it kind of like you're on your own districts for the folks at the high school level? Because their class sizes, obviously scheduling during high school is a lot different than in middle school, and certainly this would be very quote unquote easy to do in an elementary school setting. But I just kind of wanted to hear from districts how they would even attempt to maneuver that.
So, Kristen, are you asking me for the answer?
I think so.
It's definitely a challenge, because if you run a split schedule, then transportation is going to cost you more. If you run an alternating schedule, then you also have to have preparations made so that you can remote learn. You can do some at remote and you can do some at home. We've looked at all these, and not one's perfect. Each one has its own drawbacks, and on top of everything else, we are considering the needs of our community and parents that are working also. So it definitely is a challenge when you talk about schools that are overcrowded and trying to, or are small schools and just don't have the room to spread out that much. But that's currently what we're looking at right now is how we can make this work with what we currently have. Um, and I'm not sure the CARES Act money is going to be enough to take care of everything that we need to do.
And I guess my follow-up question, and this would be for Mike Rodriguez and folks at the department, we have inclusion where we may have some medically fragile kids in classrooms with regular ed kid students. So what do we, like, is that inclusion, are we saying inclusion is suspended, for this time? Like what happens then? What happens with this?
You know what? We have some experts at the department. I'd love to take that question to our team and get you an answer for that question. Great question, though. To any other hands up?
I can see them here. I think Senator Del Colo is next.
So part of what my thought was really goes to as I just look at these, certainly there's going to be expense related to having a physical barrier. We're mentioning again the issue of virtual teaching, and that raises the question of people's ability to have a tablet or whatever infrastructure they need to have in there to effectuate that. I think that, and listening to what the superintendent was just saying, I think part of what needs to happen, and it almost needs to be developed and examined like very quickly, either by the individual districts or perhaps in conjunction with the DOE to try to work with the CFOs to come up with some numbers here, because I think it's really important that we understand what the cost may look like and where things may be going so that we can plan. And we really have to be prepared to implement that in an efficient way, because we've seen within the span of a few weeks, the numbers can change. And I'm no virologist, but I remember watching the scope and the changes of what was being reported from day to day. And, one day things being kind of like looking like they're getting under control in Newcastle County. And then the next few days and a week later, suddenly we have multiple very significant hotspots in Sussex. So I just want to make sure that we emphasize that, because I don't think that it serves the districts for us to make recommendations that are not able to be implemented because of resource issues. So we have to try to understand that, or I think if not do it ourselves as a committee, we have to tee this up so that we can be ready to address that and look at it. And I don't know if there's a separate committee, because I can't remember what all the subcommittees are for the reopening aspect of this, but if there's a separate committee looking at the finance part of this. But I think that it's a big issue, and again, these types of things keep bubbling to the surface as we have this discussion.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, and a point I mentioned to Mike as well. And I think we need to do some work on figuring out where that falls, because you're exactly correct. Almost every slide has a cost to it, right? So we need to figure out what that looks like. I think Dr. Santiago is next.
Hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Yes. Hello to everybody. I also think that the program and everything that you guys have put together is wonderful, but I would like to bring you guys to my world. The kind of patients or my community is a lot of undocumented. So when you guys want to involve the parents, that's going to be a little complicated for the kind of children that we see. Also, the schools that are around my area are very, very overcrowded. So all these distances, I mean, I I know it's I don't want to be another Debbie Downer either, but you guys have to keep in mind this kind of population also, which is hard to deal with. Parents, school levels is not very high, so that's one of the issues I brought last week. I mean, the temperature and all these things is kind of hard for them. Social distancing is going to be hard in the schools in my area because of the overcrowding. So just to keep in mind that kind of population, please, because they're the most vulnerable. They live in houses with a lot of people together. So this is one of the populations that it's very, very high risk. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's extremely important. And I think, you know, a lot of thought is going to have to go into those schools about if they could do this and how they might have to stagger and or do more virtual learning. Senator Sturgeon, I think you're next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm still getting used to this format. So yeah, I'm going to stick with the advice that we don't talk about how, but what. And because I do realize there'll be a lot of challenges to adhering to these guidelines on this slide, but I actually think they're all incredibly important. And I'm picturing my classroom and how I would make this work. And everything on here makes sense. Number 3, each student should have a privacy screen or physical barrier placed at the front of the desk. I'm just going to nitpick that a little bit. Privacy screen doesn't seem like a good word. Are you imagining more like what you would have at a buffet, like a sneeze guard? Because you'd want it to be see-through, right? So the teacher could see what's going on at the student desk and the student could see the rest of the class, right?
That's correct. And I will just, commentary here. Can you mute yourself for a second?
Sure.
Thanks. I just want to respond to that. I actually asked this question to our pediatric infectious disease doctors today because I was curious about sort of what you're talking about. I think a lot of what we've heard from feedback is what's going to happen and how will this affect kids. And I just wanted to share that from a, infectious disease perspective, what they sort of said is we're just not sure how effective those are right now. And later on, we'll talk about in this scenario, we're asking kids to mask. So happy to hear folks' feedback on that. But I'll say from an infectious disease perspective, this was one of the things that they sort of weren't sure we needed. While, some of the other things they felt more strongly about. But I think to your point, if we do have those, we need to make sure that it's exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, right. Well, that does make sense. If they're able to be 6 feet apart and they're masked, then I can see where I'm going to call it a sneeze guard because it's transparent, would not necessarily be needed. And since it would be open from the top and the air that's circulating could have some viral particles, the guard wouldn't be all that helpful, but the masks and the distance would. So, okay, I hear what you're saying. If we do decide to go with that, I would think 3-sided, not just in the front, but on the sides as well. But I realize that might be going away. I just want to see if there's anything. Oh, let's see. Oh, yeah, I wanted to suggest something that's not on here. Many, many countries do this. Rather than the students rotating, the teachers rotate. The students stay in the same class all day. And this can be done in high school. It's how it's done in other countries. And the teacher comes to them. That would cut way back on the amount of movement through halls where it's going to be difficult to keep them distanced. So I wanted to throw that suggestion in, and I apologize if that's in another slide coming up.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Representative Smith, you're next.
Thanks very much, Megan. I just wanted to also bring back the parent side of this. I've gotten a lot of feedback that no matter whether you go to a blended model or straight virtual model, this one's probably the hardest one because you could do both, but that's how hard it is to make sure children are actually learning in the virtual environment, how everyone does it differently, whether it's Zoom classes all day or it's, already pre-subscribed YouTube videos made by the teacher or whatever it may be. So I will mention that I do think we need to come up with the best strategy possible for at least 1 to 2 of these phases that they are in school, regardless of how difficult that may be. And I appreciate also, I just want to mention, I appreciate everyone's diving into the details, because the details do matter. But for the sake of each of the meetings, I think it would be good if we could maybe even send those in ahead of time or send them in right afterwards, so that we can make sure that we're constantly moving forward on the high end stuff with the local control in mind that each school district is going to then have to adhere and change and adapt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Smith. I think Stacy, oh, no, hand down. Emma Brower.
I've been thinking about is coming from which was a technical school district. I'm thinking about the time I actually spent in a desk this past year, and it's like little to none that not only for my technical area that I chose, but all of the technical areas that you spend 2 hours a day in, you actually leave the classroom and you go somewhere and do a hands-on thing, earn some kind of certification or some kind of credit for that. And I'm thinking of the lab, and I'm picturing my science lab, and I'm picturing the health pro lab, and I'm picturing all the other technical areas, and the rooms are so small, and most of the time you're paired up with some form of lab partner in order to conserve space and resources. And I'm just thinking about all, not so much technical schools as well, but science classes in general, like high school science classes. I think I've had like a lab partner, always been in a tight space for that. So it's just, I guess a question for me would be, what happens when you have a hands-on class like that, when you're moving and not actually sitting at a desk? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that is incredibly insightful and something that certainly is not gotten into enough here. So I'm going to write that down, and I think that probably has to go into the further discussion. This is why we have students. They're actually in the classrooms. All right. I think Stacy is next.
Yes, hi. So a couple things, and thank you for the student mentioning that. That's very true. I also work in a vocational school, and the students are required to be in different shops. So it would be very difficult at the high school level for a teacher to rotate, as ideal as that sounds, to have the students stay and learn their English, math, science, social studies all day in one classroom. We just have teachers who are highly qualified in different areas that teach different subjects, so it would be really hard. Not all the students are on different kind of pathways and taking different areas of interest. So at the high school level, that would be really difficult. It could possibly be worked out at the elementary and possibly even the middle school areas. But I agree with the need to get students in school, if at all possible, as much as possible. The equity is the main concern that I have, and the equity to resources, the equity to support at homes, just the different learning styles that can't be accommodated at home. There's just so many different factors. And then, the mental health piece, of course, me being a counselor, that's ideal. But I was a social worker before I was a counselor, and went to homes in Sussex County where there was no running water. There was no, place to go to the bathroom inside of the house. There was some cleanliness issues. And then there's just a lot of issues. And so, school can be a safe place and a more healthy place sometimes for those students. So it's just something that we can keep in mind and try to work out if at all possible.
I think the last comment on this slide is Sue Smith, and we will try to wrap up on time tonight, but we'll talk about how we're going to handle next week as well. So Sue, go ahead.
I'll be really quick. I had a suggestion from a parent that asked about if there would be a survey sent from the districts regarding if they could keep their child home or send them to school. So a survey to see what parents are willing, because some parents are making out great and really like the virtual learning for their students and feel safer. So possibility of a survey.
Great. And the last hand up here is Representative Longhurst.
Megan. I just want to echo what Stacy said, you know, as a counselor, on the equity part, when we look at the class sizes and the 20 students in a class, and then you have to determine who goes home. I know for a fact that there's kids that are doing virtual, that we have hotspots in Delaware City and Garfield Park, that the parents are driving up and the kids are actually trying to do the virtual and connecting to the internet, in the parking lots, when other students are able to sit at home with a parent and go through, you know, their classes. So I think we really need to look at the equity of children when we decide who's doing virtual and who's not doing virtual, because that is a very big challenge. And as Dr. Santiago said, also, you know, children, yeah, the equity that those kids are going to fall further behind than what they already are behind, that we have to make every effort that we can to keep those kids in the school. And like Stacy said, their support services they don't have at home, they get at school. And we just don't want to lose that educational piece for those students. That's it.
Thanks to both of you. I think that's extremely important that we think about equity and who has access and who doesn't as we move through this. Mike, I'm going to kick it back to you, but I'm recognizing that we have 2.5 minutes. So I don't know if you want to maybe skip to closing up for tonight, talk about what we're going to do next time, and how we can maybe get through these a little bit more quickly next time.
Great. So one suggestion or recommendation could be, you know, as the committee reviews the scenario, maybe some of that information can be shared and can be captured prior to us coming to this meeting. I mean, I think the conversation was excellent. A lot of great questions, excellent points. But if we're going to meet our charge, we're going to run short. So that's just one recommendation that I have. I'm not sure how the committee feels about that, or how you feel about that, Megan. So just in closing, the next meeting is June 16th, from 5 to 6:30. We're going to include from screening students on, and then do the remaining 4. And just as a reminder, for anyone who wants to submit public comment, it will be accepted via email at reopeningideas@doe.k12.de.us, or via voicemail at 302-735-4244. Again, I greatly appreciate the great discussion that we had this evening and all the suggestions and recommendations that were made. And we look forward to our conversation next week. We'll continue to send you information for the next scenario tomorrow. And we will send you the updated or the revised essential actions where we incorporate your feedback sometime in the next couple of days. Thank you and have a good evening.